So I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country and to acknowledge that some of us are meeting on Ngunnawal country in Canberra. And I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and future, and to acknowledge the country and elders in the places that you are joining us from as well. And I was reading Bradd's article that this seminar is based on, and I read that the livestock grazing covers half of Australia. And that got me thinking about how the sovereignty was never ceded over this country, and that has meant the destruction of traditional food systems, reliance on industrial agriculture. And that's something that I'd like to keep in mind when we listen to this great seminar. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Bradd Witt, who is a lecturer in the School of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Queensland. He's passionate about research that can inform discussions and debates around complex environmental issues. Understanding the role of people in these issues and the opportunity for positive change is central to his research activities. And his recent work focuses specifically on the public's perception of the Australian beef industry. Before I ask Bradd to start, I'm just going to do a little housekeeping. If you can please all mute your microphones until question time. I'm sure we'll have some great discussions. That would be really great. This seminar will be recorded, but during question time, I'll cut off the recording there. So I'd like to hand over to Bradd. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Maeve and the team, and the invitation to present today. Thanks also for the acknowledgement to country. I'm up here based in Marburg today, not working on the campus, which of course is the traditional Yagara or Jagera, depending on how you want to pronounce the name for that language group and group of people. And yes, what you mentioned there a moment ago about the landscape coverage of grazing enterprises and businesses across Australia and that history. That's something, if we get time at the end, I might pick up on from some related work that we were doing about the future of sustainability for the Australian cattle industry. So I'll hopefully come back to that at the end specifically. So I'll try and do the share screen now and get started on the presentation. If you can let me know, just to make sure that that is coming through clearly for everyone.
Yep, that's good.
Okay, first of all, too, I want to acknowledge that there's quite a diverse, interdisciplinary and rich team. I don't mean rich in terms of finances, but rich in terms of insights and experience, including Dr. Beck Colvin, who's in the meeting today. I'll just mention first names to get through them quickly, but Glenn Beck, Catherine, Nicole, Rod McRae, Justine Lacey, and Taylor Faulkner, who's doing a PhD currently in the school. I also noticed that there's a couple of people from the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences in the seminar, so welcome to those, Jim and Stephen. Nice to see you in this meeting. So the title sort of says everything, and I'll try and cover this in 20 minutes to stick to the time and allow any questions at the end. So I won't delve into lots of detail around methods and so on, because that's frankly very boring. I'll just kind of get to the main point as quickly as possible. But I'm going to talk about issues around trust and perceptions of environmental performance of the Australian cattle industry based on a fairly large survey that we did recently across the Australian public. So without further carrying on about that, I just realised my window is covering up the screen for me. Right. So on the screen at the moment, these are just some general trends. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see what are essentially trends in the media. So I looked at the Factiva database to look at things. If you do a general search on beef or cattle and sustainability in the articles, you get the trend that's showing on the screen on the left in terms of the numbers of articles over the last 2 decades. 2020, I haven't updated this for this graph. That will have gone up slightly, but not surprisingly, given what happened in 2020, media coverage on those issues dropped in favour of other far more pressing issues for people. However, that trend is reflected. I also just did a Google Trends on veganism, for example, because we saw particularly from about 2012 to 2017, quite a lot of things like protests and a lot of media coverage on that. So that sparked people's interest in just doing searches around that. And then on the far right-hand side, I've got the Scopus database, which is a search of peer-reviewed papers predominantly, looking again at those key terms of cattle, beef and sustainability over the last 2 decades. What's abundantly clear, I mean, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to see what's going on. This is reflecting both an academic, an industry and a public interest in issues to do with livestock generally, but also cattle globally, as well as in Australia. There are concerns around the environmental footprint of livestock industries, and that's what's shown here. So that's the context really of what we tried to do with our work. We did do similar work about a decade to 15 years ago, but found a lot of difficulty in getting that up and running. There just didn't seem to be the interest in supporting that research at that time. And I suspect it was just a little bit early in terms of understanding the importance and the gravity of really trying to understand and unpack community expectations around agriculture and livestock in particular. So as I said, I'm not going to talk about the methods and get into that in any detail. What I'll start with is a story, essentially. And this story is based on our understanding of the literature, but also listening to voices coming from industry over the last decade or so. And the story that I'm going to paint on the screen is essentially a hypothesized model of how attitudes might be informing issues around trust, environmental performance, and people's desire for societal oversight over the industry or regulation of the industry. So we have a concept to do with trust, and there's been a lot of discussion around trust in a range of industries, including livestock industries, for about the last decade. So trust, we know, is an important concept, and it's being spoken about quite a lot. We can draw a reasonable assumption that if people's perception of environmental performance is positive, that will feed into and create a positive relationship with trust. So in other words, the better people think that the cattle industry is doing, the more likely they are to be trusting. The argument goes, particularly from people talking from industry, although not all voices in industry, there's been either an explicit or implied assumption that if trust is improved or increased, that will reduce the sort of perceived need for environmental regulation over the industry or unnecessary red tape. We've probably heard those terms, red tape and green tape, sometimes inhibiting industries in terms of their own flexibility. And the quote on the screen just reflects that coming from AgriFutures, from a major project on trust that they initiated a couple of years ago. The other related concept, so we would assume that if trust increases, the desire for regulatory control would go down. The other idea to and related to the need for perceived regulation on the environment is people's desire for oversight or a desire for society to have oversight over an industry. And we'd argue that if trust is improved, then that desire for societal oversight may be reduced as well. Now, underpinning a lot of this based on the literature, we would assume that people's underlying environmental values or their predisposition towards environmental issues would inform the way they perceive environmental performance. Essentially, if someone is more utilitarian in their views of nature, we'd argue that they would tend to have a more optimistic or positive view of environmental performance. So on the screen, essentially, is a simple model that we put forward to test for this paper. I'm going to jump then straight to the results of what we found, because what we found largely supported parts of the hypothesis, but also led to some rather interesting and surprising results. And it's actually the surprises that are really key, I think, in terms of some of the key outcomes from the work that we've done. So the concept of trust, revisit that. The first relationship that I put up was that perceived environmental performance would have an impact on perceptions of trust. And our structural equation modelling that was done for this work showed that the environmental performance factor had a very strong relationship with trust. So no surprises there. In fact, a very, very powerful and very strong relationship between perceived environmental performance in the Australian population that we surveyed, which was almost 3,000 people, and trust in the cattle industry. This idea of the need for environmental regulation, kind of not surprisingly, if people perceive that the environmental performance is good, then there's a reverse relationship, or a sort of a negative relationship there on the perceived need for environmental regulation. Similarly, people's view of the right for society to have oversight over the industry also has a fairly strong relationship with the need or perceived need for environmental regulation. So that part of the model makes sense and seems to support the things that we were saying in our hypothesized model. What was interesting is that there was no statistically significant relationship between trust and a perceived need for environmental regulation. So that part of our model didn't hold up. And in fact, there was a significant but quite weak relationship between trust and perceived need for societal insight, in that if trust goes up, a slightly diminished perceived need for societal oversight over the industry. So the big surprise there was that lack of relationship at a population level between trust and environmental regulation. That really did surprise us. The other part of the model that we put forward would be that people's underlying environmental values would be influencing their perception of how well the industry is performing when it comes to the environment. And there was a significant relationship there, but not as strong as I would have expected. I would have thought that that would have been a stronger relationship. What was surprising, and that we didn't anticipate in the results, in the hypothesized model, is in fact that the underlying environmental values of people had a much stronger and direct relationship on the perceived need for regulation around environmental issues, and an even stronger view in terms of societal oversight over the industry. So this is really interesting. The trust per se in its own right isn't influencing that perceived oversight and intervention through regulation, but people's underlying values has a strong direct influence on those parts. So just to revisit a couple of the key relationships here, environmental performance strongly related to trust and strongly influenced issues to do with environmental regulation, but environmental orientations or underlying environmental values had a strong influence on the perceived need for regulation or societal oversight. Now that I just presented in terms of the modelling side of the work just shows the broad constructs to do with trust and so on that were based on numerous questions that gave us those particular constructs. It masks, well, what did people really think in terms of trust? You know, how trusting is the Australian population, for example? So I've just put two graphics on the screen just to illustrate when you drill into specific questions that we put to the panel of almost 3,000 participants. On the trustworthiness, it's interesting that, but not surprising, because a lot of work that's been done shows that people generally trust farmers and agriculture over a lot of other industries. So the top graphic on the screen at the moment shows that, sorry, and just to orientate you, down the bottom was the Likert scale from strongly disagree through to strongly agree on the right-hand side. So this is the number of participants in each of those categories that's shown here. So in terms of the cattle industry as trustworthy, which was just one of the key questions that went into the work, you can see that a majority of people still feel that the cattle industry is trustworthy. This is in the context of environmental performance. There's about a third of people that are unsure or in the middle, they're neutral. And only a relatively small proportion of the population over on the left-hand side that disagree with that statement. Now, that's a little bit contrary to some of this discussion, particularly that you pick up in the media, where the industry feels as though it's under a high level of scrutiny from the public and consumers and particular interest groups at the moment. So trust is high. It's not surprising in that many surveys have shown that people tend to trust farmers. So the trust is there. What's interesting then is if we look at questions to do with environmental performance, although a majority of people still feel as though the environmental performance is okay or reasonably good, there's a much higher proportion of people in the neutral area that are undecided or unsure about what's going on out there. So that's a key part of this, is that the population on the left-hand side, there is a small proportion of people that don't trust the industry in terms of environment and don't feel that they're doing a good job when it comes to the environment. But there's quite a lot of people that are unsure and neutral as well. So based on the modelling work, as well as some of the insights from specific questions in the work, I think there's some take-home messages from this that relate to both the industry, but also those stakeholders and interest groups that have an interest in the long-term sustainability and viability of livestock industries. As we said earlier, they do occupy large areas of the landscape. So getting sustainability and environmental performance right in those landscapes can have a big positive impact in terms of general environmental sustainability. I'm not going into other aspects of sustainability at the moment. We're just going to focus on environment for the sake of this presentation. But for me, the take-home messages are, and this sounds a bit glib stating it like this, but I think the evidence from our survey really does back up the idea that environmental performance and perception of environmental performance really does matter. It matters in terms of trust, but it also matters in terms of people's perception around the need for regulation and environmental control. It's important too to acknowledge, and often this is not discussed explicitly or at all in discussions around public and community expectations, but people's underlying values are important. So people may have a view that the environment is poorly looked after, or they may hold a view that the environment's okay and it's okay to use nature for human benefits. Those are deeply held underlying human values. And what's interesting is that our study, and I didn't put any of the data up, but our study showed that most people feel as though they actually don't know very much about the Australian cattle industry. So people's perceptions in this particular issue, in this context, are largely informed through underlying values, not necessarily through the information that they might be receiving. So understanding where people are in terms of their fears and their concerns about the state of nature and the state of the environment is important, particularly because of that relationship that runs across to a desire for societal oversight. So engaging with those values, I think, is important in communications, particularly from an industry perspective, but also for more general communications for other interested stakeholders. The other thing that I think is an important message from industry, in particular, given some of the narratives that are running at the moment, just because people desire environmental regulation or societal oversight doesn't mean that they don't trust the industry. And I think that's a really important take-home message from this work, is that there is actually potentially an opportunity where if the regulatory environment is done well and appropriate, it can actually potentially work the other way and build trust or acknowledge people's concerns about environmental performance. So a good regulatory environment ought to allow people to feel comfortable that the environmental performance is being done well. So, and that regulatory environment naturally has to sit within a broader policy that might be industry governance or other policy that relates to the industry and its environmental performance. So just to repeat that one, because I think it's important, just because people want oversight doesn't mean that they don't necessarily trust the industry and its performance. And I think the other thing that's important is needs to be some fairly significant and explicit discussion about why trust. Why is trust important? So for this industry, but also other industries in the recent decade or so that have been talking about community trust, why do they want to build or maintain that trust? Is it because they hold the view that we put forward in our hypothesis, which is a fairly instrumental or utilitarian view of trust, that if we improve trust, we reduce the regulatory burden on the industry? Or do you want to improve trust because you simply want that feel good that consumers have confidence and trust you in what you're doing? And it's more of a intangible view of trust. So I think that there needs to be more in-depth discussion about trust and for what purpose. Why do we need to build and maintain trust within the community? And what's the end point? Or is there an end point in that? So just to repeat those three take-homes, I think environmental performance, but perception of environmental performance really does matter because it influences so much of what's going on. Acknowledging people's environmental values are quite diverse. So people can range from being very utilitarian in their view of nature to very concerned and deeply concerned about the future of the planet. And they need to be acknowledged in discussions about sustainability for the industry. Societal oversight does not equate to a lack of trust, and that needs to be acknowledged as well. And that there needs to be, I think, ongoing and more in-depth discussions about what is the purpose and what role is trust in terms of the future and the sustainability of livestock industries. So I've tried to keep it short and sharp to allow for some questions if there are some. So thank you, and thanks again to the team to its work. I'm doing the presentation on behalf of that team. And there's a link on the bottom of the page to the recent paper that this has been based on.